The US Secretary of State has declared that Moscow and Washington want to work towards ending the war in Ukraine in a way that is enduring, sustainable and acceptable to all sides. Marco Rubio's comments followed his meeting with Russian counterpart Sergey Lavrov in Saudi Arabia without Ukrainian or European representatives. Now, it was the first high-level meeting between the two countries since Russia invaded Ukraine.
A rare moment of diplomacy as top Russian and U.S. officials wrapped up their first talks aimed at ending the Ukraine war. Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov met with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, a major turnaround after relations had sunk to their lowest point in decades.
Today is the first step of a long and difficult journey, but an important one. And President Trump is committed to bringing an end to this conflict. The other two is beginning to engage in identifying the extraordinary opportunities that exist should this conflict come to an acceptable end.
Both sides agreed on establishing a process for settling the conflict in Ukraine. But Lavrov said that NATO expansion poses a direct threat to Russia, as would sending European peacekeepers to Ukraine.
We explained today that the deployment of troops from those same NATO countries under another flag, the EU flag or the national flags of these countries, doesn't change anything. It is, of course, unacceptable for us.
In addition to restoring strained ties, the talks in Riyadh were intended to pave the way for a future meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Though the conditions for the meeting were discussed, so far no date has been set.
Well, I discussed the meeting with our correspondent Janelle Dumalaon in Washington and our Riga bureau chief, Juri Rescheto, who's been covering Russia from there since DW was banned from Russia. I started by asking Juri what more the Russian foreign minister had said.
Well, Lavrov said that in his opinion, the USA now would better understand Russia and Russia's position after today's talks. He promised that further talks on certain geopolitical issues should be started again between the USA and Russia. And also for Russia, very important, Phil, the sanctions against Russia may be eased, at least by the USA. Even though Lavrov didn't say this so clearly, in his words, it sounded like economic cooperation restrictions should be removed. Finally, the USA and Russia also have resolved their diplomatic issue once and for all, as Lavrov put it. He meant the number of embassies in Russia and America, which had been reduced since the war in Ukraine. Now they could be reopened again in both countries.
So, Janelle Dumalaon in Washington, Russia and America talking to each other. How significant is this meeting?
You know, Phil, I think it's interesting that ahead of this meeting and now that it has concluded, the State Department really wanted to frame this meeting as a step forward, but one that is at the very beginning. So we heard from the spokesperson of the State Department saying that a phone call, so meaning the phone call between Trump and Putin last week, and one meeting are not sufficient to establish enduring peace. However, you know, this is a significant meeting in the sense that it tells us whose input the U.S. is prioritizing as it seeks a resolution to the conflict in Ukraine. If you look at the outcomes, so Juri mentioned the staffing that staffing was going to be restored in the embassies of Moscow and Washington, that there are going to be high-level negotiating teams on both sides that are trying to figure out parameters to an end to the war, as well as a historic agreement on geopolitical and economic cooperation. So this sort of gives us the contours of an agreement that at the very least does not emphasize the involvement of other allies. And I think it really does mean that we have arrived at an era where U.S. and Russian relations appear to have been reset, if not re-energized, in a way that does not bode particularly well for both Ukraine and its European allies.
Okay, let's pick up that with Juri, because Juri, is there any sense that Russia is prepared to compromise to end its war against Ukraine?
Well, look, considering that the Russians have now much a better negotiation position today in February 2025 than at the last peace talks in Turkey in 2022, one is likely to see even the smallest detail as a significant concession. For example, Moscow indicated today that the Kremlin has nothing against Ukraine's EU membership, although it should be said that this membership was not as bad for the Russians from the beginning as joining NATO, for example. But I found Putin's statement today that he is ready to directly negotiate with Zelenskyy, Ukrainian president, much more exciting. His words were reported by Kremlin spokesman Peskov, considering that Putin has been doubting the legitimacy of the Ukrainian president for months. This could be seen as a kind of concession, or at least as a signal that, yes, we Russians are willing to make certain concessions, whatever they be.
Okay. So, Janelle, what did the US delegation say about the lack of Ukrainian representation at this meeting?
Rubio did say that Ukraine will be consulted, that they will have a seat at the table. So if I can read you his quote, it's there's going to be engagement and consultation with Ukraine, with our partners in Europe and others. But ultimately, the Russian side will be indispensable to this effort. So I don't know, Phil, if that's meant to suggest to us that somehow Ukraine is not indispensable to this effort. But what it does tell us is that it is unclear whether it will be a full partner in these negotiations. And I'd also like to remind our viewers that last week, Trump was asked about this, so whether Ukraine will be a full partner in these talks. He said that's an interesting question, so that is quite a non-committal answer from him there. And ahead of all of this, you also had U.S. officials appearing to demand concessions from Ukraine without consulting Ukraine, saying Ukraine should never be allowed to join NATO, saying that Ukraine will never have access again to its pre-war borders. And we also heard from Mike Waltz saying that a practical reality is that there will be discussion around territory. And once again, Ukraine is not there. So if you were an observer and you were looking for evidence that the U.S. Really does have Ukraine's interests top of mind, or is particularly thinking hard about Ukraine, then you might have to look harder or some more.
Okay, thank you for that, Janelle. Janelle Dumalaon in Washington, Juri Rescheto in Riga. Thank you both. Well, that meeting in Riyadh has certainly given us all lots to think about. We can dive a little deeper with Bradley Bowman. He's a Senior Director of the Centre on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for the Defence of Democracies. He joins us from Washington. Welcome back to DW. Can we start with your thoughts on what's come out of this meeting, perhaps even starting with the fact that it's happened at all?
Yeah, no, this is I agree with your correspondence. This is an incredibly significant meeting. I think it's fair to say, at risk of underselling what's happened here, this is the end of Washington's effort to isolate Moscow politically. Those attempted efforts on the part of the Biden administration to isolate the Kremlin for this invasion of Ukraine, the largest in Europe since World War II, is over. And we now have, according to Secretary of State Rubio, an effort to restore some staffing levels at the embassies in Washington and Moscow, create these high-level negotiating teams. And they're even discussing what political, economic concessions might be if a peace agreement is reached, and that you'll have continued engagement between Lavrov and Rubio. So this is all very, very significant. And I think it's very unfortunate that Kyiv was not there in Saudi Arabia. When the topic is the future of Ukraine, Ukraine should be at the table, especially when they've sacrificed so much defending their country against this unprovoked invasion. And, I would say, lastly, Putin understands that the United States and our European allies are stronger together. That's why he wants to divide us. And from where I come from, we should not help Putin do that.
Okay, so that's what Putin wants. What is your reading of what the United States wants? Because to European eyes, this looks like the Trump White House has just gone through a list of Russian demands and said, oh, no NATO for Ukraine. Okay, fair enough. And the list sort of goes on. What do you see as the method behind the Trump White House apparent madness?
I do worry that the Trump administration is not following the wisdom that Donald Trump put forward in his Art of the Deal book, where he says negotiate from a position of strength. What we've seen over the last few days are various Trump administration officials weakening America's negotiating hand, and some of those were later backtracked. But I think that was unfortunate. You want to go in the strongest place possible So it seems like most of the concessions that have been discussed in the last few days are all American concessions and European concessions, and nothing from Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin, who, after all, started this war.
And so what does that tell you about the White House's approach, or indeed the White House's view of this conflict? Perhaps it says, well, it's not that important to us, or perhaps they're just incompetent. What do you read from the fact that Washington has given so much away before negotiations have actually properly started?
The essential strategic idea behind what the Trump administration is trying to do is the following: that American resources are not infinite, and that the number one threat we confront is the People's Republic of China, and we have to do more in the Indo-Pacific, and therefore we have to do less in Europe. There's that, and then President Trump himself wants the war to end. I would say, Mr. President, if you want the war to end, support Ukraine and impose more consequences on Putin and make him wince, and then you're more likely to end the war and get a better outcome. But unfortunately, I think we've seen a little bit of the opposite.
How then should Europe react to a future without US defence protection and an emboldened Russia awaiting to gobble up Ukraine and perhaps eyeing more of Europe's landmass?
I'd respectfully push back on the premise of your question. The United States is not abandoning Europe. We stand by North Atlantic Treaty in Article 5. What we're talking about here is Ukraine, which is not a NATO member. I agree some of the news is troubling. Europe's going to have to stand up and do more. Countries like Germany are going to have to spend more on defense, like Canada, France. We still don't have all European allies spending the minimum of 2% on defense. That is not helpful at this moment. So they need to follow the lead of Poland and meet their commitments on defense spending, and fast, in my view.
And so how does the US make any deal it strikes with Russia over Ukraine? How does it make that deal stick without providing security guarantees?
You know, Vladimir Putin doesn't want European or American peacekeepers in Ukraine. We have to ask ourselves, why is that? I think the answer is clear: because he's not done with Ukraine and he's not done with Europe. Why would you have a problem with peacekeepers in Ukraine if you didn't have any further plans for aggression? So I think what Lavrov and Putin are saying just in the last few days should increase, not decrease, our cause for concern.
Right. But taking on board what you were saying about this idea of Russia seeking to divide European allies, we are looking at a future where the US has normalized relations with Russia, while Europe is effectively putting itself on a war footing ahead of President Putin's next move. Can those two things cohere while America and Europe remain allies?
NATO is America's greatest grand strategic asset. And I think we take it for granted at our peril. And I think any efforts in Paris or elsewhere to try to create alternate centers of power are unwise. I think we need to understand that we need each other now more than ever. And we're going to get a far better outcome in Ukraine and Eastern Europe more broadly if we work together and understand that Putin's trying to divide us and we should not help him.
Good talking to you. Thank you for talking us through that so clearly. Bradley Bowman from the Foundation for the Defence of Democracies. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
While Russia and the US met in Riyadh, EU Chief Ursula von der Leyen was meeting the US envoy to Ukraine in Brussels. The Commission President told Keith Kellogg that Europe wants to work with Washington to bring about peace. Mr. Kellogg was in Brussels to meet European leaders. The Commission President told him that European countries are ready to step up, including doing more to arm Ukraine. The European leaders are mounting a diplomatic push to be included in peace talks after Mr. Kellogg last week ruled them out of negotiations. Armida van Rij is a senior research fellow at Chatham House and heads up the Europe programme. Welcome to DW. So, no Ukraine and no Europe at the table in Riyadh. What's your understanding of the reasoning in Washington for this?
I mean, the reasoning in Washington is quite an interesting question. We know that Trump on the campaign trail said that he would end the war within 24 hours, and then when coming into office realized it might take a little bit longer than that. But obviously the main issue is that no Europeans or Ukrainians at the table are a win for Putin, because Putin will likely think that he can try and manipulate Trump and his advisors into getting a better deal for Russia than a good deal for Ukraine. And that's, of course, the key issue, and why Ukraine and other European countries are so keen to be part of this discussion.
So why would Washington go ahead with that? Because it seems obvious to everyone from the outside that that's a bit weird. So why isn't that apparent to Washington?
What we've seen from Trump's first term is that he likes strong men and he likes speaking to them directly. And Putin is one of those. North Korea's leader is one of those. And so he will have gone directly over the Europeans' head to try and do that, essentially. And also, there's been some discussion of Trump wanting a Nobel Peace Prize. And obviously, if he can negotiate this deal on his own, he would see himself as being in the running for that.
So if Europe is to be invited at some point, would it come to negotiations with a unified position on how to end this war?
I don't think the issue is whether if Europe is invited. I think the key issue is that Europe has to ensure that it is at the table, and therefore has to put things on the table to be invited to be at the table, if that makes sense. So as you say, that comes down to being able to present a consensus-based and coherent vision for what they see as the future for Ukraine in Europe. And it needs to be able to come with clear commitments of what that would look like from their side that appeals to both Trump and both Ukraine.
And do we think that they are anywhere near close to that?
I mean, that's $1 million question at the moment. Of course, we all watched the outcome of the informal meeting in Paris last night, where coming out of that, it seemed like there wasn't really a clear consensus on whether or not European countries should be putting troops in Ukraine. First question. And then second question, what those troops would do and what they would contribute to. Would they be, a ceasefire monitoring force? Would they be a tripwire force, or something bigger than that? And now, of course, as we just heard in the program, there's the added element of Russia immediately ruling out accepting any kind of foreign troops, whether they are European under a NATO flag or otherwise, in Ukraine. So this has immediately complicated dynamics already.
And didn't European leaders have years to prepare for this, to prepare for Trump too? Wasn't there? There was all this talk, certainly last year, of so-called Trump-proofing defence and foreign policy. Why have they been caught so off guard?
I mean, that's the key issue. Yes, that's the key issue, especially given, there was perhaps a little bit of hopeful thinking on the European side during Biden's administration. And Biden came, was such a strong transatlanticist and really kind of re-fulfilled America as a global leader in the world and America's global role. So I think there was a little bit of wishful thinking perhaps on the European side to hope that the election would go towards the Democratic nominee rather than the Republican nominee. That obviously didn't happen. We know, of course, that over summer, certainly the European Commission was really preparing a task force and preparing for Trump's re-election. But the Ukraine piece and the European security and defense piece seem to have been missing from that discussion a little bit. So what European heads of government should have been doing since November, when it was clear who was going to be running the White House, is preparing for this outcome. Because as you say, it's not necessarily unexpected, but I think what has really shocked Europeans is the style rather than as well as the substance.
Thank you for talking us through that. Armida van Rie from Chatham House. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has said that he will not travel to Saudi Arabia later this week as planned. He also heavily criticised the Russia-US talks that have been taking place. He said he wasn't invited to the meeting between the US and Russian diplomats, their first since Moscow invaded Ukraine. He's now postponed his trip to Riyadh until early March. He's currently in Turkey for talks with President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and the inauguration of a new Ukrainian embassy building in Ankara. Our correspondent Dorian Jones has been following the meeting in Ankara and told me more about the Zelenskyy decision to postpone.
Yeah, I mean, President Zelenskyy's decision not to go to Saudi Arabia is, I think, sending a message of his great displeasure over this meeting being held between the Americans and the Russians in Riyadh. He said he only learned about the meeting by the media, underlining what he feels is Ukraine is basically being pushed out of these crucial talks. He said that any talks about Ukraine should include Ukraine. And he also said countries like including European countries and Turkey and the United Kingdom should all be present on deciding the future on a way of resolving this conflict. And he also said that Turkey should be the country that could possibly host those talks. Now, that was an offer that President Erdogan picked up on at the joint press statement, saying that Turkey is ready to host any future meeting on deciding the outcome of the conflict. He also pointed out, Erdogan, that Turkey has in the past played such a key role hosting Russian-Ukrainian talks back in 2022, and says that Turkey is well placed. Now, I think that the reason Zelenskyy is here on the day of the talks in Riyadh is that he is looking to Erdogan to play some kind of role of getting Ukraine back into those talks, because Erdogan not only has close links with the Ukrainian president, but also with the Russian president Vladimir Putin. And in fact, Turkey's mediating role, Erdogan stressed, was key to previous attempts to end the conflict. And also Zelenskyy will be aware that Erdogan also has good ties with President Trump. But the problem for Zelenskyy and for Erdogan is that in the past, where Turkey has played this mediating role with Russia and the Ukrainian conflict, was at a time when the Biden administration had frozen Russia out of any diplomatic talks. Now you've got Trump back in the picture now. He's ready to engage with Russia, and Russia therefore doesn't really need Ankaran's mediating help in any way. And that's underlined by the fact that these crucial talks are being held not in Turkey but in Riyadh, underlining Turkey's isolation in many ways from these crucial talks.
Okay, so as it stands then, Turkey looking to push itself as a mediator and doing what it can, not necessarily to take a side.
Well, absolutely. And in fact, Turkey in many ways does share many of Ukraine's concerns that these talks that are going on with the United States could ultimately sacrifice Ukraine and possibly hand Russia a victory in achieving all of its key goals. Because while Turkey is a close ally of the Ukraine, it also has close relations with Russia. It is concerned that Russia's growing power, if it was to win a major victory in Ukraine, and that's underlined again by President Erdogan's statements today, where they reiterated Turkey's support for the full territorial integrity of Ukraine. All of its territory should be handed back. That was very welcomed by Zelenskyy, but it's also a sign that Turkey is worried in the future about a growing, more powerful Russia if it was to achieve a major victory from this Ukrainian conflict. And there's concern with these talks going on with the United States that possibly the US is pulling out of Europe and handing Russia more power in the region. And Turkey and Russia are regional rivals in the Caucasus, in the Balkans, in the Middle East, and they'll be wary of a growing, powerful Russia, particularly in the Black Sea as well. And in many ways, I think that is bringing Turkey closer to Europe, because Europe too is worried about a more powerful Russia, and talks about building a more powerful military force, possibly to face a Russian threat, will ultimately need Turkey, because Turkey is the second largest army in NATO.
Thank you for that, Dorian. Dorian Jones in Istanbul.